Okay, quick question. What do you think humans invented first? The wheel or the written word? Take a second. Think about it. Most people say the wheel. Obviously the wheel. It feels ancient, primal, like something a caveman would have smashed together out of a rock and a stick before he even had a word for rock. You're wrong. And so was I until I went down this rabbit hole. Humans were writing things down, tracking the stars, building multi-story temples, and running actual tax systems for hundreds of years before anyone thought to slap a circle on an axle and roll something across the ground. Let that sink in. Bureaucracy is older than the wheel. Somewhere out there, a Sumerian accountant was filing paperwork on clay tablets while everyone around him was still dragging heavy stuff on logs like it was a personality trait. Tonight we're answering the question nobody actually asks until it's 3 in the morning and you can't sleep. Why did it take so unbelievably long for humans to invent the wheel? Who actually built the first one? Why entire continents never bothered? And how one dumb simple idea, a circle spinning on a stick, ended up underneath basically every piece of your life right now. Your car, your office chair, the fan cooling this room, all descendants of one very specific breakthrough in one very specific place. Roughly 5,500 years ago. Buckle up, ironically using a device that would not exist without the thing we're about to talk about. Let's set the scene. Around 3,500 BCE, humanity is already doing pretty well for itself. We've got cities, actual cities with walls and neighborhoods and social classes and probably someone's annoying neighbor. We've domesticated sheep, goats, cattle. We've figured out irrigation, which means we can grow more food than we need, which means some people get to stop farming and do other things instead, like become priests or soldiers or professional wheel haters, presumably. We have bronze, we have writing, we have organized religion complete with elaborate temples. We're basically running a functioning society. And yet, if you'd walked into a Mesopotamian city in 3500 BCE and asked someone to show you a wheel, they'd have looked at you like you just asked them to show you their flying car. So what were people using to move heavy stuff before the wheel showed up? Sledges. Just flat platforms you drag along the ground, sometimes over logs laid down as rollers, which is basically the wheel's slow, exhausting older cousin who never quite made it. You'd lay a log down, drag your sledge over it, then run back, grab the log you just passed, and put it down in front again. Over and over. It works. Technically, the same way running a marathon in flip-flops technically works. Painful, inefficient, and apparently good enough for a solid few thousand years of human civilization. Here's the part that should genuinely mess with your head. The very first wheel wasn't for transportation at all. It wasn't attached to a cart. Nobody was rolling anywhere. The first wheel was a potter's wheel, a flat spinning disc used to shape clay into pots, bowls, and jars. Think about that for a second. The wheel's origin story isn't humans needed to move heavy things faster. It's humans wanted nicer bowls. Civilization's first killer app for circular rotating objects was pottery, not transportation. We had the exact technology required to build a wagon, a disc that spins smoothly on an axis, sitting in workshops for potentially centuries, being used exclusively to make dinnerware, before anyone went, wait, what if I put this sideways and rolled something on top of it? That's not a small oversight. That's the equivalent of inventing the microchip, and using it only to make a slightly better toaster for 200 years before someone thinks to put it in a computer. Humans are clever. We are also apparently extremely slow to connect dots that seem obvious in hindsight. Keep that in mind by the way we're going to come back to it, because it happens again and again throughout this story. So who actually gets credit for the transportation wheel, the wheel and axle combo you'd actually recognize? Most historians point to Mesopotamia, roughly around 3,500 to 3,350 BCE, the same broader region and rough era where writing itself was being invented. We're talking Sumer modern-day Iraq, the birthplace of cities, of law codes, of beer recipes carved into clay, and apparently the wheel. But here's a plot twist archaeology loves to throw at people who like clean, simple story. The oldest actual wheel ever physically discovered wasn't found in Iraq. It was found in a swamp in Slovenia. Yes, Slovenia. In the Ljubljana marshes, archaeologists pulled out a wooden wheel, complete with its axle, dated to somewhere around 3,130 BCE. It's currently the oldest wooden wheel ever recovered anywhere on Earth. Not the oldest evidence of the wheel as a concept. Mesopotamian pictographs and cylinder seals showing wheeled vehicles predate it slightly. But the oldest actual physical object sitting in a museum in Ljubljana right now, having survived over 5,000 years buried in mud. So which came first, really? Honestly, the current best answer is it doesn't matter as much as you'd think, because the wheel appears to have shown up in multiple places across Europe and the Near East within a suspiciously tight window, within a couple hundred years of each other, which raises this genuinely wild possibility. Maybe it wasn't one genius in one workshop who cracked it. Maybe the conditions across Bronze Age Eurasia, copper and bronze tools sharp enough to shape wood precisely, domesticated drag draft animals strong enough to pull weight, and a growing need to move goods across expanding trade networks all lined up around the same century in different places, and multiple people independently landed on the same idea, which honestly makes more sense than one lone genius, doesn't it? Great ideas rarely come from nowhere. They come from a pile of smaller technologies finally getting tall enough that someone can stand on top of them and see the next obvious step. Quick side note, because I know someone's going to bring this up in the comments. Yes, Egypt had already built the pyramids by this point. The Great Pyramid of Giza goes up around 2560 BCE, using ramps, levers, sledges, and an absolutely obscene amount of manpower. And notably, historians largely agree the wheel played little to no role in actually building it, which means one of the most impressive engineering feats in human history was accomplished using technology one step below what we're talking about tonight. Egypt eventually adopts the wheel too, mostly through chariots introduced by outside invaders, but for a good stretch of its early history, it just didn't need it. Moving multi-ton stone blocks with ramps and brute force apparently worked fine, which tells you something important right off the bat. The wheel was never inevitable. It was useful. Those are not the same thing. Now let's talk about why this took so painfully long, because the reasons are more interesting than cavemen dumb, and also because it explains something people almost never think about. The wheel is deceptively hard to build well. Here's the actual engineering problem. It's not enough to carve a circle. A circle rolls, sure, but a circle attached to nothing useful is just a stone frisbee. The real breakthrough is the wheel and axle system, a wheel that spins freely and independently around a fixed rod, while bearing serious weight, without splitting apart, without excessive friction, and without the axle itself grinding down to dust within a week of use. To pull that off, you need a few things lined up simultaneously. You need metal tools sharp enough to shape wood with real precision. Flint just doesn't cut it, pun fully intended. You need to understand load-bearing structure well enough that your wheel doesn't crack the first time it hits a rock. And critically, you need somewhere reasonably flat and firm to actually use the thing. A wheel is basically useless in deep mud, dense forest, or steep mountain terrain. Ancient wheels needed roads, or at least worn paths, hard-packed, cleared ground, which means the wheel wasn't just an isolated invention. It was the product of an entire ecosystem of surrounding technology and infrastructure finally being ready for it. That's the real answer to why so late. It's not that nobody thought of a circle. Rolling logs had already taught humanity that round things move easier than flat. That lesson was ancient. The late part was solid metal tools, refined woodworking, and the right terrain conditions all converging at once. The wheel wasn't held back by imagination. It was held back by infrastructure, which honestly is a very on-brand human problem. We still do this today. Genuinely great ideas sit around for decades, waiting for the rest of the world's technology to catch up and make them actually usable. Okay, so the wheel exists now. What happens next is basically the ancient world's version of a viral trend, except it takes centuries instead of a weekend. And instead of a dance, it's death and taxes. Within a few hundred years, wheeled carts start showing up all over Mesopotamia, pulled by oxen and later donkeys, hauling grain, building materials, and goods between cities. Trade routes that used to be limited by how much a person or pack animal could physically carry on its back suddenly get a massive upgrade. You can move more, farther, with less labor, which means bigger cities can be fed, which means empires can supply armies further from home, which means, and this is the part that always gets glossed over, the wheel isn't just a convenience, it's an economic and military multiplier. Civilizations that had it had a genuine structural advantage over civilizations that didn't. We're going to circle back to that because it explains one of the strangest gaps in world history. Then, around 2000 BCE, the wheel gets its first real glow-up, the spoked wheel. Early wheels were solid discs, either a single thick slab of wood or 3 planks fastened together and trimmed into a circle. Functional, but heavy. Heavy wheels means slow speed and enormous strain on the animals pulling. Somewhere in the steppes north of the Caspian Sea, likely the Sintashta culture in what's now Russia and Kazakhstan, someone figures out you don't need a solid disc at all. You just need a rim, connected to a central hub by a handful of thin wooden spokes. Same strength, dramatically less weight. This sounds like a minor engineering tweak. It is in fact one of the most important military innovations in ancient history, because the spoked wheel makes the war chariot possible. A chariot with solid wheels is heavy, slow, and honestly kind of pathetic as a battlefield weapon. A chariot with spoked wheels is fast, light, maneuverable, and terrifying. terrifying. Suddenly you've got two-person crews flying across open ground at speeds infantry simply cannot match, raining arrows down before wheeling around and doing it again. Egypt adopts it, the Hittites adopt it, the Mycenaeans adopt. For roughly 1,000 years, the chariot is the ancient equivalent of a tank, and none of it happens without a slightly less heavy wheel. Sit with that for a second. An entire era of ancient warfare, the era of Ramses the Great, of the Trojan War, of massive Bronze Age battles between empires, is downstream of somebody on the steps deciding a wheel didn't need to be solid wood all the way through. History does not always turn on generals and kings. Sometimes it turns on a carpenter having a genuinely good idea. And the ripple effects go further than just battle tactic. Once chariots become the ancient world's must-have military asset, entire economies reorganize around supporting them. You need skilled wheelwrights, craftsmen whose entire job is building and repairing spoked wheel, which was genuinely specialized, high-value work, closer to being a master engineer than a simple carpenter. You need horse breeding programs, because a chariot is useless without animals fast and strong enough to pull it into battle and survive. You need timber trade networks, because good wheel-grade wood, flexible, strong, resistant to cracking, wasn't available everywhere, so kingdoms without the right forests had to import it. The Hittites, in fact, become so good at chariot warfare and wheel construction that other empires actively recruit their engineer. Ancient headhunting, essentially, except the skill being poached is knows how to build a really good wheel. An entire military-industrial supply chain built around a piece of curved wood spinning on a stick. If that doesn't tell you how seriously the ancient world took this technology, nothing will. Meanwhile, over in China, the wheel takes its own path and produces one of the most quietly brilliant tools in human history, the wheelbarrow. Chinese engineers, by around the 1st century BCE, figure out that if you put a single wheel at the front of a cargo frame, one person can move a load that would otherwise take 2 or more people carrying it on a pole. It's not flashy. It's not a chariot charging into battle. It's just relentlessly, boringly efficient, which, if you think about it, describes most of the inventions that actually changed everyday human life the most. The wheelbarrow doesn't win wars. It just quietly makes every single farm, construction site, and mine in human history dramatically less brutal to work in. China also runs with wheeled technology in other directions. Elaborate wheeled toys, wheeled irrigation devices, and eventually some genuinely sophisticated cart and carriage designs for the elite, complete with suspension systems that would put some modern furniture to shame. There's also a persistent theory worth mentioning. Even though historians still argue about it, the idea that the wheel might not have been invented just once or even just a handful of times, but independently by different peoples responding to the same underlying problem in isolation from. This is sometimes called convergent invention, and it's the same phenomenon you see in nature, where unrelated species evolve similar features because they're solving similar problems. Think of how both bats and dolphins independently developed echolocation despite being about as biologically different as two mammals can get. Some historians argue Mesopotamia and Eastern Europe developed wheels independently within roughly the same window. Others argue the idea spread through trade and contact faster than we give ancient people credit, hopping from culture to culture along the same routes that were already moving grain, metal, and pottery. Honestly, the evidence supports a bit of both, depending on the region, which is a nice reminder that history is rarely a single clean line. It's usually a messy, overlapping tangle of independent genius and shared borrowing, and untangling exactly which is which keeps archaeologists arguing at conferences to this day. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange, and this is the part that I think deserves way more attention than it gets. Huge parts of the world simply never adopted the wheel for transportation. Not because they were less intelligent, not because they were primitive, which is a word I want you to mentally delete from your vocabulary for the next few minutes. They just had extremely good reasons not to. Start with the America. This one blows people's minds every single time because it's almost never taught properly. The Aztec and Maya civilizations knew about the wheel. We have physical proof. Archaeologists have found small ceramic figurines, toys essentially, built on little wheeled platforms dating back over 1,000 years before European contact. So the concept wasn't a mystery to them. They understood rotation, axles, and rolling motion perfectly well. So why didn't they build wheeled carts and wagons for actual transportation? Two brutal practical reasons. First, no suitable draft animal. Mesoamerica simply didn't have horses, oxen, or anything comparable strong enough and tame enough to reliably pull a heavy loaded cart. Llamas exist in South America and can carry light loads on their backs, but they're not built to pull heavy wheeled vehicles. Try it, and you'll mostly just get an unhappy, uncooperative llama. Without a powerful draft animal, a wheeled cart is something a human has to pull or push themselves, which, across long distances over difficult terrain, offers basically zero advantage over just carrying things directly. Second reason, the terrain itself was often actively hostile to wheel. Dense jungle, steep mountain paths, mountains, through the Andes, no cleared road networks built for cart traffic. A wheel is a fantastic piece of technology on flat, hard, cleared ground. It is a genuinely bad piece of technology on a narrow mountain switchback or through thick rainforest. In those conditions, a person with a pack or a llama with cargo strapped to its back massively outperforms a cart that would just get stuck, tip over, or be physically impossible to push uphill. So the Aztecs and Maya made a completely rational engineering decision. They looked at the wheel, understood it, and essentially said, not useful here, thanks. It's not that they failed to invent something, it's that they correctly assessed it wasn't worth the investment given their actual environment, which honestly is smarter than blindly adopting a technology just because it exists somewhere else. Sometimes the more advanced move is knowing when not to use something. And it's worth pointing out what they built instead, because it's not like Mesoamerican civilizations were somehow behind. The same societies that skipped the cart gave us precise astronomical calendars accurate enough to predict eclipses centuries in advance. Monumental stone architecture built without metal tools or draft animals at all, and, in the case of the Inca, further south, an empire that stretched thousands of miles along the Andes, held together not by wheeled roads, but by an extraordinary network of footpath, rope suspension bridges, and relay runners called chasqui, who could pass a message across the entire empire in about a week. No wheels involved anywhere in that system, and it worked spectacularly well for the terrain it was built. Different tools, different priorities, same underlying goal: move information and resources efficiently across your territory. They just solved it without a single spinning disc. Sub-Saharan Africa tells a similarly complicated story, and it comes down to one of history's most underrated villains, the tsetse fly. Across huge stretches of the continent, this one insect carries a parasite lethal to horses, donkeys, oxen, and most large draft animals. No draft animals means no practical way to pull a loaded cart for the exact same reason the Aztecs faced. Combine that with dense forest terrain in many regions, and once again, wheeled transport just isn't the winning strategy. Instead, human porterage, carrying goods directly, often astonishingly efficiently over long distances, remained the dominant transportation method in many regions for millennia. Not backwardness, adaptation to an environment where a completely different solution simply worked better. And then there's Australia, where Aboriginal cultures never developed wheeled transport at all, largely for similar structural reasons: no domesticated large draft animals, vast arid terrain that didn't favor cart infrastructure, and cultural and economic systems built around different priorities entirely, like sophisticated land management and resource use finely tuned to their environment. It's worth pausing here because there's a pattern threading through every single one of these examples, and it's easy to miss if you're rushing through it. Notice that in every case, the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, the missing ingredient usually isn't imagination. It's ecology. It's the presence or absence of a specific animal, a specific terrain, a specific insect. History likes to hand out credit and blame based on cleverness, as if some peoples were simply smarter or more innovative than others. The wheel story quietly argues against that. It suggests something a lot more humbling: that human intelligence has been remarkably consistent across every continent and every era, and what actually varies wildly is the raw material each environment hands you to work with. Give two equally brilliant societies different animals, different landscapes, and different resources, and you will get two completely different technological paths. Not because one group tried harder, but because they were playing entirely different games with entirely different boards. So here's the real, uncomfortable, but fascinating truth hiding underneath this whole story. The wheel wasn't secretly the obviously correct technology that every intelligent human society would inevitably stumble onto. It was one specific solution that happened to be perfectly suited to one specific set of conditions: flattish terrain, available draft animals, established road networks, and spectacularly unsuited elsewhere. We tend to tell history as a straight line of progress, where everyone is racing toward the same finish line and some cultures just ran slow. That's not what actually happened. Different environments produced different, equally intelligent answers to the same basic problem: how do I move heavy stuff without breaking my back? Now, back in Eurasia, once the wheel and the road network and the draft animal all lined up, things escalate fast. Wheels show up on war chariots, on farm carts, on merchant wagons rolling along trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Roads get built specifically to accommodate wheeled traffic, and this is where we start seeing something genuinely important: infrastructure investment as a direct consequence of a single tool. The Romans, centuries later, will take this to an absurd extreme, building an empire-spanning road network so good that some of it is still physically intact and walkable today. All of it ultimately downstream of a spinning disc first used to shape pottery in Mesopotamia. And the wheel doesn't stop at transportation either. Once you understand rotation around a fixed axle, you unlock an entire category of machine. Water wheels, which power mills that grind grain automatically instead of by hand. Gears, which let you transfer and multiply rotational force. The exact mechanical principle sitting inside clockwork, and eventually industrial machinery. Spinning wheels for textiles. Potter's wheels, still obviously going strong this whole time. The pulley, technically a wheel with a groove for rope, which lets you lift weights far heavier than your own body could manage alone. Every single one of these builds directly on the same core insight. Rotational motion around a fixed point is an unreasonably powerful way to move, transform, or multiply force. Here's a way to really feel the scale of this. Fast forward past the Bronze Age, past Rome, past medieval mills and windmills, straight through to the 18th century, and the wheel is still the beating heart of every. Steam engines use wheels and gears to convert heat into motion. Textile factories run on spinning wheels connected to belts connected to bigger wheels connected to water power. The entire Industrial Revolution, arguably the single biggest transformation in how humans live since the invention of agriculture, is essentially one enormous, elaborate arrangement of wheels, axles, and gears scaled up to a civilizational level. And it keeps going. The automobile, obviously. Trains, running on wheels precision engineered to grip steel rail. Bicycles, genuinely one of the most efficient machines humans have ever built, in terms of energy spent versus distance traveled, and it's just 2 wheels and a frame. Airplane landing gear, office chairs, skateboards, that little wheel on your suitcase that made air travel marginally less miserable sometime in the 20th century. Every single hard drive that's ever spun to store your data. Every clock that's ever ticked, powered by tiny interlocking gears that are structurally just very small, very precise wheel. You are, right now, almost certainly within 10 feet of at least 5, probably more. And every single one of them traces its lineage back through 5,500 years of human history to a potter in Mesopotamia who just wanted to make a rounder bowl. Even the way we measure and understand motion itself owes something to this. The mathematical concept of a circle, degrees, radians, the constant pi that every student groans about in school, got studied, refined, and formalized in no small part because ancient mathematicians were staring at rotating wheels, millstones, and celestial bodies and trying to describe what round and rotating actually meant with precision. Even something as abstract as geometry has fingerprints from this one very physical, very practical invention all over. The wheel didn't just move goods across continents, it nudged an entire branch of mathematics into existence just so people could describe it properly. Let's close the loop, because I promised you we'd come back to that opening question. Why writing beat the wheel to the punch? The answer isn't really about which idea is smarter, it's about what each idea required. Writing needed a shared symbolic system and something to record it on. Clay, basically, which was already lying around. The wheel needed precision metal tools, an understanding of load-bearing mechanics, domesticated draft animals strong enough to make it worthwhile, and terrain flat enough to actually use it. Writing was, in a strange way, the easier problem. The wheel needed the rest of civilization to catch up around it first. And that's honestly the most human part of this entire story. We like to imagine invention as a lightning bolt moment. One person, one flash of genius, one eureka. The wheel's real history says otherwise. It says great inventions are usually less about a single spark and more about hundreds of smaller pieces of infrastructure, knowledge, and need, quietly stacking up until the obvious next step finally becomes obvious. And it says that different peoples in different environments looking at the exact same idea can arrive at completely different and completely rational conclusions about whether it's even worth building. So next time you're sitting in traffic or rolling your suitcase through an airport or watching your car's tires eat up highway miles without a second thought, remember what's actually underneath. Not just rubber and metal. 5,500 years of accumulated trial and error, false starts, independent discovery, brutal environmental constraints, and one very patient potter who had absolutely no idea that spinning a lump of clay would eventually put humans on the moon. Because that's really the punchline here, isn't it? The most consequential machine in human history, the thing underneath your car, your factories, your clocks, your entire modern world, didn't start as a solution to a transportation problem at all. It started as someone trying to make a slightly nicer pot. Never underestimate the small, boring idea sitting quietly in the corner of a workshop. Sometimes it's not boring at all. Sometimes it's just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up.